right. Hello and welcome everybody back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Today we're going to be discussing some quick updates from ScholarAI, taking a look at some of the science news that all of us are reading and learning about, taking a look at some of the business developments, both in AI and outside of it, and kind of just generally discussing holiday plans and other things that we have going on. So thanks so much for joining us. Looking forward to copying this with you. So Lakshay, why don't you get us started? Where are you going to be spending the holidays? What do you have planned? Kind of feel free to.
Yeah, I'm hoping to be in Hawaii for a little bit, just like a week. We'll see how much of a vacation it actually ends up being, but hopefully some time by the beach, enjoying the sunlight a little bit away from the rain of the Pacific Northwest.
Sounds terrible. Yeah, I'm really, really, really sorry about that. Zach, you wanna follow that?
Yeah, so instead of a sunny beach in Hawaii, we're going to be hanging tight here at home. We got a little baby, so we are not going to be traveling these holidays, but have some family visiting, so that should be fun.
Good. Hannah, where are you going to be?
I am making the 8-hour drive to Dallas tomorrow. So I'm going to go spend some time with my dad, spend some time with my family. It's been a few months since I went home, so my dad's pretty excited. But
Very good.
excited for the holiday.
Very good. Yeah, that'd be great. We are heading the opposite direction of Lakshay. My wife and I are headed to New York for the first. We're going to be spending the Christmas holiday in Durham, so nothing super exciting there. But we'll be in the city for the New Year's festivities, which we'll report back on whether that's a success or not. We've been looking at some dinner options, and they are not cheap, to say the least. So we'll see what we end up getting in the middle of for that. But all right, good.
I think, Damon, we told you that Susan used to work for Waterford Crystal, which is the company that actually makes the glass for the New Year's Times Square ball.
I don't know that I knew that. No. I mean, I think, knew she was based in that area for a while, but not necessarily aware of that.
Yeah. We actually got to go to some parties in the building where the Times Square ball is. And during the party, you get to walk upstairs and go look at the ball itself. And it's lit up, a bunch of different colors and everything. It was really cool, especially when you're not there actually on New Year's Eve when there's not as many crowds.
Yeah, no, we are very much trying to find a way to avoid the bulk of the crowd. My wife is adamant that we're going to do ice skating at the Rockefeller Center and stuff like this. But as far as the actual Times Square crowd on New Year's, we're gonna try to avoid that one. So that's good. What's the inspiration, Lakshay, for Hawaii? Just never been, just want to see it, or what?
No, it's a pretty common place that we've gone to over the last couple of years. I think it's just being from the Pacific Northwest, it's just a far cry from the sort of winter environment. I think more than anything, it's just a escape from the clouds and darkness that tends to envelop us this time of year. So yeah, no, nothing in particular planned, just a little bit of time, hopefully a little bit more outdoors, a little bit of time relaxing, that sort of thing. So it should be good.
Yeah, sounds like fun. We were out there 2018, I guess. We were in Maui. I don't know which island you're going to, but we spent some time in Maui, so great place. Okay, great. Well, happy holidays to anyone who is joining us here around the holiday time, depending on when you're consuming this, depending on which holiday you celebrate. Hope you're enjoying it. Hope you're getting to spend some time with family, friends, hopefully taking some time off work and really enjoying your time. So let's hop in. Lakshay, why don't you kick us off? What have you kind of been reading this week? What have you been learning about? What's kind of piquing your interest right now? Can be AI, can be, kind of anything.
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of especially in regards to this project, I've been spending a lot of time just kind of deepening a lot of my learning, especially on the ML hardware side. A lot of the stuff we're working on kind of requires a level up of systems. So I've been spending a lot of time talking with friends, and I'm reading. I even have this is much more theory heavy than it is any sort of realistic code, but just trying to get a little bit deeper into the AI deployment, AI understanding, especially as we're going forward and building more of these stuff on our own.
Yeah, so talk us through a little bit about that. Not necessarily the specifics, but I mean, so another thing that you've been doing recently is with regards to improving our semantic search functions, and with that comes some fairly compute intensive algorithms and processes that you've been running. So if you would just take us through that a little bit, some of the changes that you're seeing, some of the ways that you've been able to reduce time, that kind of thing. I think it's interesting from a perspective of building AI applications or kind of learning about these things.
Yeah, I think especially for anyone who's developing in this space, something you'll kind of run into pretty soon, I guess, is that if you're trying to run something open source, depending on how much like content you're trying to like put into a vector database, or how much you're trying to be able to like retrieve using vectors, and how big that content of the mass of that content is, it's pretty compute heavy. Like it's very expensive to like run these GPUs, especially on the cloud, that are able to do this sort of stuff for you. If if I were able to like support or like cloud services off of just like stuff I was running on my own GPUs at home, phenomenal. But obviously that's not a trivial undertaking. So I think especially in this time where like open source is going forward, and like there's also options for APIs, when we're in the space of research, the size of content that we're interacting with is like, as people have seen, like we have 200 million papers that we can possibly search. But 200 million papers, especially in the context of building a database that's like AI native, is a very, very expensive operation, right? It's like a lot of time on a GPU. You need a really quality GPU if you want to go faster. So a lot of the time that I've been spending, at least, and I'll be talking to some of our other engineers about this, is figuring out how we can make that faster while also kind of cost optimized, which is kind of the constant dance, especially in the startup setting.
Yeah, and we'll touch on it a little bit later. I think because one of the stories I want to touch on when we start talking about the business of AI is exactly what you're talking about, and is the hardware to kind of enable these systems, so that the compute, if you will, the chip companies, NVIDIA and others. And so we'll touch on that a little bit later. But that's really great. So sounds like some textbooks, some online reading. I know AWS has some excellent resources. Would you point anybody in any other direction as far as if they wanted to kind of dig into this rabbit hole that you've been in the past week or so?
Yeah, I've been finding that there's a lot of kind of like nice content that's kind of scattered throughout. Like I've been finding like kind of like I've been going through like a many like nested links found through like Hacker News, found through like other like kind of tech publications, Medium, kind of just chasing wild geese almost, of just trying to find resources. Obviously it's fairly new and fairly hot as a topic. So it's more and more stuff is emerging about like how you run these models on your own. Um, I've personally just been using like on top of the searching, just like going through like ChatGPT, engaging with it, like telling me like, okay, like tell me about the hardware requirements of this sort of system. Here's like a GitHub page describing this like model, all that sort of stuff. Help me understand like what the compute requirements might be. Just like doing all I can, especially in the context of like all of the other stuff we're building and trying to manage all that. Lots to learn, but all good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. Zach, you want to build on that? What have you been kind of learning about the last week?
Yeah, so aside from ScholarAI, with my research for my PhD, our lab just published a paper. It came out earlier this week. That basically is using machine learning models in order to represent biological systems. So I work with bacteria, and bacteria will grow at an exponential rate, and they kind of slow down. And you can use machine learning models in order to represent that space and basically reduce the number of dimensions you're looking at when you study them. And then we take those reduced dimensions and then apply that to solve different problems, like are these bacteria antibiotic resistant? If so, which antibiotics? So I've been both looking at the paper that we kind of just published, that as well as spending a lot of time thinking about how can we take this project to the next level? How can we use newer machine learning models? I don't want to even admit how many tabs I have open on my browser right now on the Hugging Face website, looking through and trying to understand in what ways maybe some of the existing transformer or diffuser models out there could be applied to the research that I'm doing.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating bridge, because I know obviously, given our work with ScholarAI and the recent kind of public consciousness that is surrounding ChatGPT, we think about the AI, I think, generally speaking, in terms of large language models and helping us generate new text, or, AI facilitated search, or simple question asking and answering. But, we've been very much kind of playing in the world of, kind of the more basic machine learning research for a while now. And so I think the bridging of these two worlds, as it's kind of beginning to emerge, is going to be a fascinating space, and one that we kind of hope to pioneer with ScholarAI. So I'd be curious, Hannah, if you've been kind of touching on any of the learnings over the last week, if you'd like to share some of those.
Yeah, for sure. Kind of on like the different side of things, we've been working on building just a lot of educational resources, just about the basics of ScholarAI, but also kind of how that ties into the timeline of AI in general, the beginnings and all of that. So kind of on my end of like research and what I've been into is just like getting back to the basics of like, how did all of this even begin? Like, when did OpenAI come in? What is Google's role in this? What's Microsoft's role? Like, kind of what's all the key players' role in this like thing that has grown so fast and so quickly? Being someone that's not as much on the technical side and that's a little bit newer to AI, kind of like just really like honestly getting back to the basics. So kind of like what I've put in practice is there's a lot of good podcasts that I like, and I just go back to like their first episode and I just start from there rather than starting from their newest episode. And it's done a pretty good job of helping me understand this timeline of how all of this came to be. And then something that I haven't really started diving into, but I looked into today, and I know Damon and I spoke about, Microsoft just released an intro to AI course that I'm super interested in taking. I know NVIDIA did one too. And then after doing some digging about both of those, Microsoft also has like an AI and business course, which I'm pretty excited to take. They're only like an hour and a half to 2 hours long. So it's a pretty decent amount of information and not a lot of time. So but yeah, overall, just like getting back to basics.
That's great. I think as an interesting anecdote, people are often surprised to learn just how far back the introduction of, especially like neural networks as an example, go. I mean, talking many decades, sometimes all the way back into the 80s or so. I mean, I think that most people put a pin in 2017 or so with the release of the paper that's titled "Attention is All You Need," and that's typically what people point to. But the underlying technology for the transformer architecture and other things, predate even that paper by, like I said, maybe up to 30 or more years. So there's a lot of history to digest there. And again, as we're collectively as a society waking up to the potential of these systems, it's interesting to kind of take a almost historical perspective to the kind of the emergence of this technology. So Hannah kind of alluded to it. I mean, I think one of the things that I've been most interested in learning about with specific regards to AI this week has been Google's new release of what they're calling their Gemini model, or the Gemini Ultra model to be more specific. I mean, I think I didn't read through the entire, 60-page or so, whatever document they released, but kind of just looking through some of the critical benchmarks and how it may or may not surpass GPT-4. It's interesting. And I think that I've always been curious to see how far Google wants to dip their toe into the AI market. It seems intuitive to me that with as much data as Google has available, they probably could build some incredibly powerful models. There's some recent reports that they've been doubling down on infrastructure spend to increase their compute. So it'll be interesting to see how their progress, especially as it compares to other people building, these quote unquote foundational models, compares over time. So, I think speaking of that and kind of as a launching point, one of the things that I wanted to speak on, one of the information kind of, fallouts as a result of Sam Altman's recent kind of exit and reentrance at OpenAI was this idea that he may or may not have been raising money for another chip startup to somewhat compete with AMD and NVIDIA. And it's interesting to me, kind of reflecting on the bottleneck that exists in AI right now, which is kind of the access to some of the compute. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on, kind of the difficulties of getting chips, how we kind of see that market maturing, changing. Anyone want to comment on kind of NVIDIA's kind of strangling of the market right now and kind of where we think that might go?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like obviously like semiconductor industry, chip industry, like GPUs have existed for a long while. It's just that given the cost intensive manner of like trying to spin up a new company or spin up like it's the same way as like these dominant brands that like own like, hey, like making shoes is really hard. Like not everyone can just casually make a shoe, right? And that creates like a barrier to entry on something like GPUs, hardware, where you need fabs, you need a supply chain, you need like all sorts of stuff to just make this one single product work. I think we're seeing a lot of startups wanting to play in that space. I believe Microsoft released an announcement saying that they're working on their own hardware as well. So to me, it seems like a lot more obvious that the people who are going to succeed in trying their own hardware are going to be these big, like massive, like companies that can just like funnel cash towards problems of supply chain, towards problem of like resourcing, manufacturing. Um, I'm curious as to what the strategy of these startups are, especially when you look at like the ones that like, for example, like Sam Altman has an investment in like a hardware startup, and seeing how far that investment can take them in developing like a shippable product.
Yeah, I think the underlying thesis there is probably that there's such an increased market demand that will seemingly sustain that even if you can't get to 100% the capacity of NVIDIA, there's still a market opportunity there and potentially a area for innovation. I think that NVIDIA has done a great job in leading that space and probably is most likely to continue to do so. But I constantly see other kind of news snippets of potential competitors, right? Google has their TensorFlow and the Tensor chip, and then apparently, allegedly, Apple is also working on some chip architectures that is going to be running some AI native models in the iPhone, and you can imagine how powerful that could be. Again, if executed well. So, Zachary,
I'm very. Oh, sorry.
I
was just gonna say I'm very curious as to what Apple's going to come up with, like hardware wise. I mean, like we've already seen like the amount of like hardware that they're able to fit in the watch, especially since they moved away from Intel, has been like very, very impressive. And so obviously they're like well positioned, whether that's like through their existing suppliers or through like their just like existing supply chain, like product like development, that they can develop very, very capable hardware and just keep it inside their platform.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that's very compelling for people who like want to develop, like researchers. If these chips and GPUs continue to be something that's like locked behind like just availability, and Apple has like a very exclusive platform that just has hyper capable hardware, it could be very interesting, I think.
Yeah, and Apple remained dominant in kind of establishing and maintaining an ecosystem in which their products play nicely with each other, and almost create a pseudo walled garden for their products. So I agree, it'll be fascinating to kind of see how that emerges. Zach or Hannah, either one of you want to kind of comment to this?
I don't really have too much to add to what you guys said.
Same.
Sure. Cool. Okay. Anybody else as far as the business news you guys are seeing or anything else? One other bit of news that I found somewhat interesting was Greylock, which is for those that don't know, a fairly prominent venture capital firm who's been making pretty widespread or emergent, I would say, investments in AI, released a vertical AI presentation deck, whatever you want to call it, that I found kind of very compelling. And essentially the central thesis argument there was that in order to create sustained lasting value in AI, the most reasonable approach is to create vertical systems in which you're hyper specializing to use cases, you're delivering incredible user value. And I think in some ways that aligns to some of the things that we've been building, while kind of also being simultaneously in opposition to some of the use cases that we're seeing with systems like ChatGPT and ScholarAI that's built kind of in unison with ChatGPT. And so, wanted to give people space to kind of react to that, build off that, maybe comment as to how you think that might shape our approach at ScholarAI, or might not, if you have an alternative opinion.
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in on this one. So I went ahead and read through that article you shared earlier, and I think kind of two big pieces that jumped out to me. It talked about kind of one area in which you need to be focusing on if you're going to be building a vertical application is having that kind of domain knowledge. I think at ScholarAI, we've done a nice job of recruiting people with knowledge of the research space. We have, myself and Damon are PhD researchers. I know Lakshay did some undergraduate research. And I'm not sure if you've done any or did any or not during undergrad, did you?
Not like more than a normal amount in my typical business undergrad. Like I wouldn't say I had a hyper focus on research, but I would have used ScholarAI in school. So yes and no.
Nice. But yeah, so at the end of the day, we've got people who have a background in research, have, use this tool. I think that's going to be really important as we start to think about what is kind of that niche to dive in. So let's take, Damon and I as an example. We're both biomedical engineering researchers. We know our fields quite well. We know some of the problems in our fields. We know areas where we need to solve specific problems. That actually, working together, all of us, is how we put together the whole idea for ScholarAI in the first place. We knew there was a need for kind of helping researchers to find relevant papers to what they're looking for. And it's not always the most cited papers that have the most impact on your research. It could be something less cited. It's a little harder to find. So having that knowledge space is going to be really important. As we transition the product to think about new ways to build it out, I think kind of continuing to build up the team with those with domain knowledge in the research space can be really helpful. If we decide to jump into like a new vertical, that's where we need to think about, pros and cons of including different parts, like patent law, right? Patent law, we see a really clear link between what we're doing now with research and patents. There's a lot of overlap in that space. But at the same time, do we have the domain knowledge to dive right into that? Do we need to get, some input? Now, whether that is pulling someone on the team, whether it's just customer interviews, or if it's building a product and seeing if it works, keeping that need for domain knowledge is going to be important. So I'll just kind of stop there before going into my other thought in a minute.
Yeah, I think like when you take a step back from like company and like mission and you just like look at like purely product, like something that's kind of emerged, especially in talking to researchers, that like we have research is very, very all encapsulating, right? There's science, there's business, there's humanities. There's very, very many fields and many different ways in which these different categories of researchers want to interact with knowledge, right? Something that stood out to me in one of our meetings, like one of our customer interviews, is that we kind of offered up two UIs. One that was like a little bit more discreet, like kind of explained the paper piece by piece. And like when you ask a question, like would break down a paper and not collate them together, right? Someone like a humanities researcher greatly preferred like the collation idea, like having like, okay, there's like 70 papers, like let's merge them all together. Just give me a quick summary, like talking about the findings related to the question I asked. On the other hand, someone like a pharmaceutical researcher just wanted the numbers from each paper just listed out, right? And when you look at that kind of juxtaposition, I think that's just kind of like a reference to the bigger challenge, I suppose, of like, the more focused you get, the better product you can build for that focus, right? Like we're an engineering team. We have limited time, limited resources. And the way that we allocate our energy matters a lot, right? And so something like a UI change, it's minor, like that's something that we can very quickly pivot. But when you take a bigger like step back on that perspective, being narrow to me like has a significant value in that you can build like a 99% product as opposed to an 80% product for a lot of people, right? It's just always a careful dance as to picking like what is that correct segment, such that like the value you're delivering is for like a meaningful size of people.
Yeah, well, actually, I think the kind of cool thing about that we've seen, right, is like we built this tool for research, like scientific researchers. And then we found out there's different pockets like journalists using it. I don't think that's something that we necessarily thought would happen right away. So I think that's kind of a cool area where like, I agree, you build for the 99% use case, but who's using it 95%, who's kind of an adjacent market that we didn't even realize was there.
Absolutely.
So that's been cool to see.
Yeah, I think it's just like always like there's so much we can build. I think it's just like making sure that like there's so many, our user base is like very, very wide, right? Like the more we can do to like satisfy a lot of people while still like being like, here are like the best features for like power users, I think is like the careful balance to figure out.
I think all those are, go ahead, Anna.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think a big part of that is like product education too, like how we're communicating the different ways that we can apply to all these industries. Because I think like fundamentally, like our core features can apply to all of these industries very simply. Like we search abstracts, we have a huge database, but like how do we take that and go beyond it and be like a one-stop shop for a business major, a journalist major, like a science major? Like we're able to find the right abstract for them, like that they desired. Hopefully, like they asked a few questions, got to the specific one that they really wanted, but they take it a step further. They're able to cite their sources, have whatever formats generated for them. And then if they're a Zotero user, have that directly into their reference manager. But also, like, let's say they don't really have time to sit there and read through the whole entire abstract. They're able to have the summaries. So, like, all that to be said, the way that we communicate that to our users, I think, is so important, because automatically, like, it's big that we have over 200 million abstracts in our database. That's huge. I think that's probably the first thing that people hear, and like a lot of the times what they might catch on to. But like, it's really important that we're able to like be that one-stop shop for all of these different users, and like give them these different features that they don't need to find another tool to summarize the PDF when they know that they could do it with us.
I think all those things are incredibly well said. I think the way that it's kind of formalizing in my brain, or at least evolving in my brain over time, is remaining hyper-focused on building the best technology with specific regards to a user base. And as we're seeing in AI, when we have done that, and we've done that successfully, over the short course of ScholarAI, we've actually found that the user base kind of broadens as a byproduct of that great technology. And we don't really know exactly who will gain all of the value out of AI. I think that we could spin an argument that says everyone, well, anyone essentially that uses search that needs to synthesize information can find value in AI, and exactly what that packaging looks like is still to be determined. I think additionally, the ways that I'm thinking about this also involve creating value in what we're beginning to refer to internally as beyond the keyboard. And Lakshay, this is an idea space that you and I have kind of been speaking about for a little bit, is that how do we take these AI insights and kind of accelerate the process of whether it be, research in the hardcore kind of STEM sciences or humanities or otherwise. How do we actually continue to provide value beyond just AI generated responses in like a typical chat interface, right? So we're in the early days of kind of thinking about what that might look like, how we kind of push our value beyond the keyboard. But I do think the companies that are ultimately able to deliver the most user value will be able to take then all the way from kind of insights to impact in whatever that workflow looks like, right? That kind of transition between having the information and acting upon it looks different for different professionals, but kind of no matter what your professional domain is, once you have information, you have to kind of then act upon it appropriately. And the more so we can facilitate those processes, especially as it, is specific to the research community, I think the more value we will ultimately be able to add. So anyone want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, I think especially in the context of like seeing all these new models, seeing Gemini come out, like ChatGPT Turbo, I think something that's become like pretty clear to me is that like this idea of AGI, like it eventually like being a thing that exists, is not going to just be information summary, right? It's not going to be it's not going to be all knowing, right? An AGI is something that can act in some capacity. I think like when we're thinking about like what the future of AI and science looks like to me, it means that like you have to be able to drive some level of real world impact. Not saying that like right now our AI tool is going to go ahead and like plug away at chips for you or something like that. But just think about like, what can we do to make real world impact for a researcher easier, right? Thinking about more than just like, how can we help you right now collect information? How can we help you do something with that information? I think is going to become a more important question, especially in the aspiration of AI going forward.
No, I agree. And I think that there's some debate around the timeline of when we might begin to approach some sort of AGI, especially with regards to kind of these, again, going back to the kind of the thesis of vertical AI, kind of how much specialized AI is necessary in order to actually get to some sort of general sense of AI, and exactly what that means, I think, is still open to debate. But in any event, delivering user value is kind of going to be ultimately the name of the game, no matter what. And so, as long as we continue to remain, kind of steadfast in our approach to deliver high value to the researcher, I think we're going to be in a really, really good place. So anyone else have any business news that they would like to get the reaction from the group from?
I'm curious how is everyone feeling after the Gemini announcement? Have folks been following that at all or no?
Yeah, I've been following it pretty closely. I mean, I don't know, following it in the sense of like I'm always curious when these new technologies, quote unquote, are released to see how they're comparing to previous technologies where the advantages might be. I'm still of the general sentiment that anytime large language models get better, we all win, right? So anytime a system is released that is more capable, whether it comes from Google or from open source, OpenAI, pick your favorite flavor of company. I'm of the opinion that as those technologies advance, ultimately they're tools, and the real value will be driven by the humans working in concert with these tools. So I'm very happy when these tools improve. I'm always interested to see how they can kind of improve the workflow that I use in the day to day, and hopefully they enable new workflows and kind of things that were not previously possible.
Yeah, I'm curious to see. I think like the race behind LLMs has always been kind of measured by like benchmarks, right? Like, oh, how good does it perform on like this assessment questions, or this like known kind of program that you can kind of give it and say like, here's math, how well can you do math? Here's like medical questions, how well can you do those? I'm curious as to what the kind of like next stage of value add on these LLMs is going to be, because I also feel like at some point like the ability to just like summarize existing data on the internet is going to have depreciating return, right? Like I think between like GPT-4 and Gemini, like it's a matter of a couple of percent on most of these benchmarks, right? Which is like nice, but to the end user, like that's not going to be like game changing, right? I'm curious as to how especially these big companies are looking towards like being competitive with LLMs and like what that means for features, right? Does it mean context windows? Does it mean like what the cutoff dates are? How do they kind of think through like what is our competitive advantage on our LLM and what makes it like a unique tool that stands out over the other ones beyond just benchmarks?
Yeah, I mean, cutoff data is always going to be important. I think that's something like companies like us try to solve that by helping people use actual databases. Curious to see how that continues to be integrated. For example, when I mentioned earlier, I was looking through some Hugging Face models today. I was trying to get an explanation for how to use some and go into ChatGPT because that's an easy spot to kind of go get information. Based on cutoff dates, they didn't have any information on what I was looking at, so I had to go kind of alternate routes to do that. So I think that like eventually we are going to have a world where it can always kind of get the answers regardless of the cutoff training data or not. And I just don't know, what is the difference between, I guess I kind of began to where, all right, let's assume all language models come out are fairly similar, even if they're improving by a few percentage points. Where can you provide the most value in terms of getting data that is fresh and new? Is it the LLMs good at searching the internet? Is it relying on companies like ours? Like what is going to be kind of the currency or the way these behave going forward after, they're all performing at kind of that same level for the actual language?
I think two thoughts. Number one, I think newly trained large language models would always have some moderate advantage over a previously trained model. So in some ways, the most recently published model, assuming relatively similar access to data and compute, would, at least in theory, outcompete the previous large language models simply because their cutoff data is more recent. There's been more knowledge put into the world that those large language models during training have had access to. More specifically, secondarily, with regards to your questions of how these large language models in their kind of search and synthesis functions access different sources. Your point about the context window is true, although there probably you could feel some pushback in saying if training becomes so cheap once GPU technology advances such that you can kind of in real time train these language models almost every day, as an example, the cutoff window, if you will, might be a vanishing problem. However, what will remain evergreen, at least in theory, is the need to prioritize sources. So even if the large language model has access to all the training data, depending on the context of the prompt, there's going to be highly relevant to not relevant at all a spectrum of answers. And how a large language model is kind of ultimately fine-tuned to these different use cases, I think is an area that is kind of under active investigation. And I'm not exactly sure people have a full grasp on, is a model built specifically for use case X going to kind of in perpetuity be better than a general purpose large language model that can also do, task X, basically. And so I really think there's some debate over there, even if the problem of the context window does eventually go away. We've also seen, just as a comment too, kind of the prioritization of sources, how you do that well, how you maintain relevance to the specific prompt. We've had several requests from users of direct tracing. For example, even when the information is synthesized, they would like to know which part of those answers came from where, and to know if they can essentially trace the process of the large language model such that they can get a very clear and transparent, almost roadmap of where those answers came from. Hey, Shashi. We are reacting in some ways to the recent kind of AI news, kind of business at large. So wondering if you wanted to add any thoughts as you're settling in there to that. We've kind of covered things like Google's release of their new Gemini model, the kind of vertical doctrine that Greylock and others have kind of come out with, emphasizing the importance of building vertical AI applications, and then also touched briefly on Sam Altman's potential new hardware startup. So feel free to take that in any direction you'd like.
Yeah, I'll jump on the Gemini thread. I've seen the videos, I've seen the metrics posted. Have you heard of anyone building an application on Gemini? It would seem like before we get too far ahead of ourselves in terms of what Gemini is capable of, it would be great to hear some real world stories from people trying to build applications on top of Gemini to see if it's capable.
Yeah, I think there's going to be from what I saw, I believe like GCP has like a hosted Gemini option. I don't know if that's like release ready yet or if it's just like beta phase for some users, but I think we'll begin to see kind of stages of like the hacker, like San Francisco, like let's build types, like ready to kind of take off with it whenever that's out. And so I imagine we'll begin to see projects and people spinning off stuff that like kind of similar to what they do with OpenAI APIs, and seeing like, I imagine that'll probably happen within like a week of Gemini being API ready, whenever it does end up on GCP.
Mm-hmm. Lakshay, what do you think of that, the 3 model kind of approach rather than kind of one common model, like having the Ultra, the Pro, and the Nano?
Yeah, I think there are definitely use cases. The way I look at it, especially in the context of what we do, is you see open source. Open source is very common to have like different sizes of models. OpenAI obviously has like many, many different sizes. I think in looking at like a startup case, I always look at it as that like use the correct model that provides enough value return for your current stage. Like POC, I would not use anything bigger than like whatever their Nano or whatever it is, just because the cost isn't that worth it. But as you're kind of evolving and like your user base grows heavier and heavier, and like the standards of whatever your product or offering is has to go up, you should probably keeping up with it, assuming that there's like a measurable, or rather perceptible value add between like a middle layer model versus like the top tier per se.
Now that there's a default kind of provider on the LLM space with OpenAI, it feels like there's, at least my perception, I'm curious how you guys see this. My perception is it would take a substantial advantage for something like a Gemini or even a Llama to steal market share. I mean, a Llama may be a different case in that you can kind of roll your own, host it yourself, kind of do whatever you want with it. But for a kind of a direct commercial competitor that's not open source, like a Gemini, it feels like they're going to have to demonstrate more advantage either on the cost or the performance in relation to ChatGPT to steal market share.
Yeah, I think especially looking at the enterprise side of things, like inevitably, like consumers, there's always inertia. Like people have their preferred cloud providers, like AWS has ties with Anthropic. So someone who's like playing with these tools for the first time might just end up using Anthropic-based tools to start off with, right? I think especially when you look at like big enterprises that like have relationships with all these cloud providers already, it's just going to be more of like, where are you already living cloud provider wise? What is the offering that they're giving? And is the value out of switching that worth it? And I don't think for most enterprises, like there is a significant change between like Anthropic versus OpenAI versus Gemini that make someone say like, oh, we need to be on this different cloud provider. You just find that there's like a between like the salespeople having like very direct ties within like these big enterprises and just like difficulty of like having to migrate cloud platforms. It's very, very kind of like I feel like the way it's gonna end up playing out is that like companies have their cloud provider that they stay with. If you're like a big company, if you're a big enterprise, odds are you're not going to move that much. You might have like small teams internally that are like playing with these APIs on like other providers as it's like handy and easy to POC stuff with. But ultimately, like whoever provides like a good cloud offering is going to provide it to who their existing customers are. And if there's a crazy, crazy feature add, like let's say like native web browsing in our AI LLM tool, you can just check that box off and have it there. Then I could see migrations happening. But obviously, very early days for these APIs to be offering something like that.
The only counterexample to this that I'm thinking about the story of Zoom and Google Meet, and so Google had these video conferencing tools for a long time and didn't really drive them to broad adoption or success, and left room for Zoom to kind of create a niche and create market share. You can come up with all the criticisms that Google rightly deserves for their inability to continually invest and develop real products beyond their core offerings. But then the one thing that sort of mitigated Zoom and their ability to run away with that market was that Microsoft came in with the kind of included in our bundle approach, which was widely criticized in tech circles of like, they're just undermining tech innovation by putting their product, their Microsoft Teams, into all of their enterprise suites. And isn't this a really bad thing for the market? But that's the one thing that's sort of out there in my mind as a way of combating the market share that OpenAI has already kind of accumulated in their first mover advantage. And the only company that I could see, I mean, I'm sure I'm missing an important part of the picture. The only company I could see doing that would be Amazon with AWS. I mean, if they could sort of magically roll out like, oh, included in your AWS subscription, here's a very easy pathway to just start using our API for an LLM, and it's just as good and free. And wouldn't you want to use that instead of OpenAI? And that's the one play I could see like really stealing market share.
So it's interesting to hear you say that about Google Meet. So I was working at a company before COVID, before everything was Zoom. And I witnessed a switch from Microsoft products to Google products, which to Alexia's point, big undertaking. And then we were using Google Meet all the time for our meetings, actually. It was very commonplace. I wasn't there during COVID, but I'd be surprised if they switched to Zoom. But to kind of lead into that then is, you're talking about how do you combat that? If Google comes out and says, you know what, Gemini can very easily interact with all of your Google Docs, such that if you're a large corporation already on Google, everything you do is in Google Docs. Gemini is already set up to do that, handle that easily. That could be an area where it's, hey, I can spend 10% of the time to set this up because it's already integrated in my Google Docs. Everything's accessible, and I can, when you click share on a Google Doc folder, right, you can just say share, like allow access to Gemini. Something like that, I think, would be a really kind of key area where they could build that in to make it natively usable at the enterprise level.
Yeah, interesting. It leads me to think like, who are you trying to steal market share from? If it's developers, then your interface point needs to be where the developers, like who already has significant developer traction. And for something like AWS, where everybody's using it, I mean, at least not everybody, but a significant portion of the developer market is using AWS. That seems like a point where you could intercept all the downstream kind of activity. If it's something like Google Docs, then it wouldn't, in my mind, it wouldn't be an API. It would be some kind of like roll your own GPT style thing, a no code kind of application where you could build off of Google Docs because the person you're trying to attract is a no code kind of person, presumably.
Yeah, I think my general sentiment on this is as we keep progressing and these LLMs get better, there will almost be, well, actually, I kind of alluded to this earlier in the conversation, but there will be a point of diminishing returns where the newest model is only going to be, usable or advantageous to very fringe, very specific, very important use cases. And for 90+% of the use cases, like document editing, like information sourcing, information synthesis, a lot of this intelligence, quote unquote, is going to become commoditized. So to Zach's point, you might be interacting with a Google or a Google co-branded large language model while you're inside of Google Docs, but immediately when you switch into Microsoft Word, you might then be working with, OpenAI because of their collaboration over there. And so I think that there will be a period in the not so near future where people are interacting with these large language models and not really having any idea which ones they're actually interacting with. And the experience among them will probably be almost imperceivable. Again, if you're excluding the very edge, most extreme cases, for example, medical diagnoses or something like that will use a very specific model with very transparent, disclaimers around which ones are being used, I would imagine. That said, the counterpoint to that is that even with the AI features that are embedded in the Google Doc experience right now, anytime I am drafting a first pass of a document, I do so in ChatGPT and copy and paste to the Google Doc, simply because it's just faster and perceivably better, in my opinion, right now. That delta will probably diminish, but for the time being, there is at least a perceivable difference in the kind of GPT-4 model and some other models that I've tried to integrate into my workflow.
The chip conversation is an interesting one. To pick up on that, it leads me to think that Sam's intuition is that hardware is the real bottleneck, and it will be for the foreseeable future, because this is an initiative that will take years and years. A brain-based chip design, it's certainly not going to be production ready in the next 2-3 years. So this leads me to think that Sam sees the real economics being led by, and the bottleneck being driven by, chip and hardware. What do you guys think?
I mean, it's the current bottleneck today. I mean, we see that ChatGPT is stopping like subscriptions literally just because there's too much load on their hardware. I think going forward, especially as like software becomes easier, just as a result of literally these same systems, I think there's going to be like an interesting kind of return to trend, I feel, of like movement of like engineering to hardware efforts, of just like, instead of like software being like the hot thing you study in college and making sure like you go get like the hot tech job, writing like front ends or whatever, like it might shift back the other way, like looking at like, how can we make like manufacturing systems better? How can we make chip systems better? To then get like ultimately like these major value unlocks, which are just tied to how much like silicon can we produce in the world? How many fabs do we have in the world? Where are they, et cetera?
Nice. Yeah, that's a great observation.
Yeah. We also kind of, as a tangent earlier, Josh, were commenting on Apple's emergence into this market and their ability to integrate kind of vertically throughout their products that now includes hardware and kind of what player they might become in this space. But we are coming up on time for today. So we want to thank everyone for joining us on the ScholarAI podcast. Please check back often. We should be uploading videos roughly every week. So please check at all the typical locations that you're finding your podcast, especially check out our YouTube channel. And thank you all for joining us.